September. Hi, you guys. Okay, we figured out the seats pretty good. It's always a real guessing game, so thanks for your help on that. My name's Sarah Fox. I'm the host and curator of Sense of Place. Welcome to Sense of Place Season 15, the very last show of 2024. It's good to see you here. It's good to see a blue light that represents all the people at home via the live stream. I wanted to say we offer the live stream for free, but of course it's not free to produce. And so many of you donate when you RSVP for your live stream tickets, and I appreciate that because it helps cover the cost and help us keep doing it, because that means these stories get out to even broader audiences, which is important. I want to especially thank our sponsors tonight. One of the things I was thinking about is what makes a healthy ecosystem. Carnivores, like wolves, are part of that. But there's also healthy ecosystems have all kinds of complexity to them. And I'm very proud of the fact that our sponsors are a mix of businesses, nonprofits, individuals, people who've been with us for a month, people who've been with us for 15 years, and I think that says a lot about our community here that continues to support us again and again, and they don't run from me when they see me walk in their coffee shop asking them for their donation, so, which I do. Thanks, Dog River Coffee, which, by the way, Les Perkins, I just want you to know you've got some making up to do for your late RSVP. I also want to let you know Sense of Place is a program of Mount Adams Institute. They are an awesome local nonprofit that supports Sense of Place, but is also doing work all over the country to help connect people with jobs that support our natural and wild places. So if you haven't, check them out online, Mount Adams Institute. So I spend a lot of time listening to anyone who will talk to me, because I'm always trying to figure out what's on people's minds, what do they want to know, what's kind of the current zeitgeist of curiosity in the Gorge, but also in the region. And as part of that, I will ask audience members, if you have a topic you're wanting to learn more about, let me know. Send me an email. Talk to me after a show. If you know someone who we should be hearing from, let me know. I can't know it all. And I remember a couple years ago, I got an email from a woman, and she said, in sort of a just exhausted way, I could hear it in her words, could you do a talk on human and wildlife interactions? Because I feel like we need to learn more about this. And if you live here in the Gorge, I can imagine you probably all have a few handful of stories of not necessarily your own interactions with wildlife, although maybe, but just knowing that this is a topic that happens here in the Gorge. We're not an urban place. We do interact with wildlife. And so that desire sort of percolated in my mind. And I knew there's never, as with any story or area of expertise, there's never a singular way to approach it. And so when Lara applied, Lara Volski, I was really curious about how was she approaching this topic of human and wildlife interaction. And also, boy, she's really going at it with wolves. I mean, it's not like squirrels and people. That would have been the easy one. That would have been really cute, too. She was really taking it to 11 right from the get-go. And it got me thinking about wolves in general and why, of all the critters, this one seems to evoke such big feelings and passion around it, especially since I would imagine most of us have never seen a wolf in real life. Most of us probably never will, and yet I can imagine there's probably some really strong opinions about them here. And I started thinking about this whole humans and wildlife and how that shows up with wolves, and thinking about how many fairy tales we have of the big bad wolf, the three little pigs, Little Red Riding Hood. And I thought about my own childhood. I'd forgotten that I had one nightmare that is very memorable could go into much more detail than I will, where, it's getting vulnerable here, guys. In my nightmare, I was probably like second or third grade. It's nighttime. It's this time of year, kind of dark and depressing outside. And my family, I can see, and we lived in a ranch house, and at the end of the hallway was the dinner table, so you could see in there. And my family is happily eating dinner at the dinner table. And I'm in the hallway riding a wolf. Riding it makes it sound like I was in control. I was not in control. I was sitting on the back of a wolf, not able to get off, and the only thing I had, and don't judge me, but the only thing I had was a wooden spoon in my hand. And I was bopping it on the head, couldn't get off, somewhat disturbed that my parents at the end of the hallway were doing nothing to help me. And I will tell you, for months, and I'm not exaggerating, my mom's here, I don't know if she knows this, when I would get into the minivan at night, I would sit with my legs up on the seat in case there was a wolf underneath the seat in the minivan. And I would go to my bedroom at night to go to bed, and I would stand at the door, flick the light off, and then I could do one step jump into bed in case there was a wolf under my bed. And this was one of my bigger fears as a kid. So I'm thinking tonight, I'm like, okay, we got the big bad wolf. I was like, but hold on a minute. We just got a dog. And I'm watching documentaries about dogs with my kids. And I'm reminded that most of us have an ancestor, or a lot of us have the ancestor of wolves in our houses. And we feed them, and we snuggle them, and we say we're not going to let them on our furniture, and then we let them on our furniture. And I thought, how interesting is that? We've got the big bad wolf, and we've got the ancestor of man's best friend. And all of this connects with human and wildlife interaction. So I'm wondering about this. I'm wondering, is it the big bad wolf? Is it the ancestor of man's best friend? Is it a cow killer? Is it an ecosystem helper? Can it be both? Is it neither? And about that point, I think, thank goodness, I have someone who knows a lot more than I do, which is Lara Volski, because she's been wondering about this for a long time. In fact, she's been wondering about it here in the Gorge with people who will potentially see wolves or have them impact them. So Laura is this interesting combination of an ecological scientist. She can talk to you some about the wolves and the biology of them, but she's also combining social science with it to really, truly look at this human and wildlife interaction piece of it. And so tonight, she's going to share why her research that initiated with this idea of learning more about wolves came to eventually include people. So help me welcome Lara Volski to Sense of Place Season 15. Thank you.
I'm gonna have to check when I get in my car for wolves underneath my seat. It's good to know, in my bed too. Thank you so much for joining me tonight. I'm excited to speak with you all. We're gonna be talking together about people and wolves in the Columbia River Gorge. So let's get started. So Sarah really hit it on the nose. What is it about wolves? It's a question. I think it's the question I'm trying to answer. You hear phrases like the Washington Wolf Wars, and you wonder what could make an animal so polarizing, more polarizing than arguably any other species. People say we only relate to wolves in the extreme. We either love them or we hate them, and either emotion isn't doing much good. When I started my graduate studies, I was warned that I was not picking an easy topic. Wolves may be the most studied wild animal in the world, and yet so much about them evades us. It's not that we don't understand their hunting strategies, or their habitat needs, or their social dynamics. It's that we don't understand what it is about them that affects us so much. And this isn't just a local issue or a state issue or a national issue. This is a story that is unfolding in multiple countries across the world. So it's no understatement that wolves can stir up a lot of conflict. I've personally never known the feeling of losing an animal that I loved and raised to a wolf. But over the past 2 years that I've spent working on farms here in the Gorge, I do know what it feels like to be tearing out your hair night after night because something has picked off one of your chickens. And I know what it feels like to walk into a pasture and see a calf that I knew dead while her mother stamps her feet in balls. And even though wolves were not responsible for either of these incidents that I witnessed, I imagine that the feelings of sadness and shock that coursed through me would not be foreign to anyone who has struggled with livestock loss. And so in this way, it's not so hard to understand why to some, the wolf is not welcome. If you haven't read it, there's a book called Wolfish by Erica Berry. It's about wolves in the Pacific Northwest. And Erica Berry writes, "I had thought the story of the wolf would bump into the story of the cow, but it was also the story of drought, heightened wildfire seasons, increased suburban development, ranches going out of business and being turned into ranchettes. Following OR7's life, and OR7 was a wolf, had not just made me care more about wolves, it had made me care about the long-lashed cows and the people who tended them. I have found the same. From packing up our farm under evacuation orders during the Tunnel 5 fire, to watching 2 ranchers I respected deeply have to relocate from the Gorge because they could no longer afford the cost of living, to conversations I had with folks that were supposed to be about wolves, but ended up about these brewing anxieties concerning the future of rural living and the future of being able to share the joy of this way of life with future generations. Between all these things, I'm starting to learn that the story of the wolf is a story of people. We are twin protagonists, but as for the plot, whether this is a happy story or a sad story, that's gonna be up to us. So, I study large carnivores. Starting my graduate studies, I thought I would be spending all of my time tracking their tracks in the snow, or going to kill sites to see what they were hunting, or doing howl surveys to see what the population counts were. And don't get me wrong, I still do get to get my feet muddy and get out in the field, but time and time again, wolves had led me back to people. And more than anything, wolves have taught me the value of 2 things: the value of trust and the value of lived experience. I'll explain what I mean as we progress through this talk together tonight, the value of trust and the value of acknowledging each other's lived experiences. It's definitely not what I thought I would learn from wolves, but it's because while humans can have a huge impact on wolves, and we do, wolves can also have a huge impact on humans. And if we don't acknowledge that impact and work together to solve the problems it can create, our trust in each other erodes. And there's nothing lonelier than that. So we need solutions. But what good is a solution if it's not helpful to the people or animals that it's supposed to help? What good is a solution if you haven't asked folks, is this even helpful? Unfortunately, you can't interview a wolf. I've tried. The best I can get is watching their behavior behind trail cameras. But I can interview people. So that's what I did. I decided that before I began any research, I would ask people what they thought about wolves and what they thought that we should do as a community to support each other about wolves. What would help them feel more secure? What experiences do they think is important for others to know? Do wolves fit into their sense of place? Pun intended. Do they belong here in the Gorge? Answering all these questions, it meant that I interviewed folks throughout the Gorge, specifically in Klickitat County, about the recent establishment of the Big Muddy Pack. These interviews led me to another surprise. I didn't expect that through this research, I would find a community that has become so important to me. Now, I wouldn't necessarily recommend that anyone go about finding community in the Gorge the way that I did. I cold called phone numbers in the phone book. I wandered in unannounced to gas stations and general stores and sat down with the people who were willing to sit down with me. It was very humbling, to say the least. And I knew that the dirty W word would brand me as a certain kind of person. On top of this, I knew that I was asking a lot of people. I began my research in the summer, which is the busiest time of year for people who work in agriculture. And it felt like a lot to ask people to sit down and share their hard-earned knowledge with me, knowledge they had gained over their own lives, working and recreating and living in the Gorge, knowledge that had been passed down to them over generations. And I didn't want to be the type of researcher that is extractive. That means I didn't want to come into a community, learn all that I could from them, and then bounce out without ever giving anything in return. So I tried my best to practice reciprocity. Sometimes this was small. It meant I turned up to these interviews with a basket of goodies from the farm I was working at as a thank you. But the biggest thing I could do is the promise to listen and share folks' experiences if they want them to be shared. I wasn't there as an advocate or as an educator. The best thing I could do is promise to share these experiences with others and to listen with all the best intentions that I could. So, I'm going to tell you a story. It's a story about wolves. But really, it's a story about the people that live here that I met in the Gorge, because I really do think our stories are aligned. Our story tonight has 4 chapters. We're going to start with our first chapter, which is an introduction to wolves in general. So when you think about wolves, you're probably thinking about a pack. You're probably thinking about an alpha, a beta, an omega, and they work together in this pack in kind of a hierarchical structure. This is true for wolves that are in captivity. This is not true for wolves in the wild. In the wild, an alpha, that's a breeding pair. It's a mom and a dad. And every other member of that pack are their pups. They're related to them. Those pups grow up and raise the next generation, or they disperse and they start their own family. Wolves, they live in packs because they hunt together to take down prey that is much larger than them, prey like elk and deer. Wolves are coursing predators. That means their strategy is to run really fast and outlast their prey. That's different from a cougar. That's an ambush predator. So a cougar is going to sneak up on its prey. And wolves are extremely social animals because they have to work together to take down their prey. So we often hear the idea of a lone wolf. That's something of not a myth, lone wolves exist, but that's the most vulnerable kind of wolf there is because a wolf needs its pack to survive. Wolves are so social, they have more muscles in their face than coyotes do, because coyotes, they can live on their own or they can work in packs. Wolves, they really need their pack. So they have more muscles in their face so that they can communicate with more expression and nuance. Just like humans, we have more muscles in our face because we're super social animals as well. There are 3 types of wolves in the United States. The wolf that we have in Washington state, this is the most common wolf, is the gray wolf, Canis lupus. These wolves can be gray, they can be black, they can be white, and they're kind of your default wolf. There are 2 other types of wolves we have in the United States. They're also Mexican wolves. They're smaller than gray wolves. There are only 257 Mexican wolves left in the wild, and they occur in Mexico, Arizona, and New Mexico. Finally, the smallest wolf we have are red wolves. They're only a little bit bigger than a coyote. There are 19 red wolves left in the wild, and they are entirely in South Carolina. So, wolves were once here, and they aren't here, and now they're coming back. And that's not true just for the United States, that's true for a ton of countries, as you can see across the world. So why did wolves go away? This was largely due to human activity, whether it was hunting or whether it was on purpose. In the United States, this was on purpose. So in the late 1800s through the 1930s, it was government policy to remove all wolves. And this was successful. Other than Alaska and a small corner of Minnesota, all wolves were removed from the United States. So you might be thinking, okay, then why are they coming back? You probably remember the reintroduction of wolves to Yellowstone National Park in 1995. They reintroduced wolves from Canada, both to Yellowstone and to Idaho. And this was a pretty big deal. You probably remember that as well, just to demonstrate how big of a deal this was. This reintroduction, it resulted in 120 public hearings, 160,000 public comments, executive directives from 6 US presidents, dozens of congressional committees, and $12 million in scientific research. So, yet again, we see wolves are a big deal. So if that's the background of wolves in general and in the United States, let's zoom in to wolves in Washington and the Gorge. So, wolves in Washington. Wolves have been returning to Washington since the 1990s. The first pack officially established in 2008. They came down from Canada, they came over from Idaho, they came up from Oregon. You'll see most of the packs are in eastern Washington. And so wolves are no longer federally listed as endangered in eastern Washington because they have enough packs. But they're still state listed as endangered across the state. Washington is very unique in that it has something called the Washington Wolf Advisory Group. This is a group of stakeholders all throughout the state. They're ranchers, they're hunters, they're environmentalists, and they come together about 4 times a year to have emotional, vulnerable arguments. And these are public meetings. I try to go to every one that I can, and boy, do they get argumentative. But the reason that they're able to do that is after every meeting, they go out to the local restaurant, they meet in a different part of the state every time, and they talk about things that aren't wolves. They talk about each other, their families, their jobs, plans they have for the next year. And because they get to know each other as people, they're able to come back into that room the next day and have these arguments, knowing that at the end of the day, they can maintain those relationships. Why are they fighting? They're having these arguments because it's their job to come to some sort of consensus so that they can make recommendations to the Washington Department of Fish and Wildlife on how to manage wolves. So this is something that does make Washington quite unique that they have this. But we're not here to talk about Washington, we're here to talk about the Gorge. So we have the Big Muddy Pack, and this arrow I have here shows roughly from where they originated from as they walked down here to the Gorge. The Big Muddy Pack established in 2022 2 wolves, a male and a female. The female wolf disappeared sometime in 2023, and then another male wolf came into the county, and he was hanging out towards the Simcoes. So for a while, we had 2 male wolves. That other male wolf was killed in October of this year, so we now have 1 wolf. The Big Muddy Pack, I am talking about a single guy. This is that single guy. This painting is a cherished gift from a dear friend in the audience. She painted it looking at a camera trap photo of the Big Muddy male on this cherry wood bark that she stripped herself. It's something I love this painting. And any photo that you see throughout this presentation that doesn't have photo credits, that is of the Big Muddy male here in the Gorge. So when I've told this story before, I've taken a lot of care to explain to others why the Gorge, what makes this place so unique. I definitely don't have to do that for all of you tonight, but if you'll indulge me just a little bit, I might just gush because this place is truly fascinating. From volcanoes to mushrooms to freshwater clams and the most unexpected and surprising high meadows, the stories that people can tell me about this place are endless. I realized that from one of my very first days on the job when my farm host showed me journals dating back 6 generations. I also had someone draw me a map to the center of a volcanic crater where compasses don't work anymore, and he told me how he navigated there by intuition alone. I had another interview where a cow jumped over the fence in the middle of the interview, so we had to get on horseback to corral this cow out of the fence. That was one of my more fun interviews. So I could go on, but truly the stories that people can tell me about this place are endless. And I'm gonna let the people that I interviewed do most of the talking for me as we go throughout this talk together tonight. But I'll just start with this quote because I think this person described the gorge quite beautifully. They said, "The gorge is really a thin ribbon of humanity. Like when you think about the entire Cascade Mountain range, fully extended, it's about 75,000 square miles. Roughly the size of the 10 smallest states combined. And so in the 10 smallest states, the population density is over 4,000 people per square mile. Here in the gorge, we're only 10 people per square mile. And so it is very rugged and very rural, and the people out here are used to seeing wildlife." All right, let's get into the bulk of our conversation tonight. Let's talk about the interviews, the people I met, the histories I learned about the gorge, and what they want you to know about their experiences with wolves. But before we dive in, I'm just gonna set a little bit of background on how I conducted these interviews. So I conducted these interviews while I lived and I worked on a farm, and my tools were really simple. They were my phone, so I could audio record. They were an interview questionnaire and a confidentiality agreement in which I promised to never reveal the identities of the people I spoke with. I used a snowball approach. So what that means is you show up unannounced to places and you cold call people, and then you get someone who's kind enough to give you some time. And then you say, well, who should I talk to next? And they tell you who you can talk to next, and you reach out to them. And then you talk to them, and you say, who should I talk to next? And they tell you, and you reach out to them. And slowly your network grows, and you start to realize, oh, wow, I do have a community of people that I know and that can share information about this issue with me. I base these interviews off this model called hazard acceptance theory. And this model essentially suggests that someone's willingness to live with a large carnivore are based on these elements: their perceived risks, their perceived benefits, the sense of personal control they have over the situation, trust, and their emotions. But truthfully, I use this model as a way to provoke conversations and ask people how they would like to be engaged with about this issue. This model, it was here to provide us some structure, but I really did try to center these interviews around what people wanted to be shared. So if that deviated from these questions, all the better. I spoke with 36 people over 29 interviews. And sometimes folks will say, oh, you spoke with 36 people. How do you know this is representative of what people have to say in the gorge? And my answer to that is I tried to get an equal number of people who were both supportive and resistant to sharing a landscape with wolves here. And then I also tried to speak with people who had different amounts of influence. Because you want to talk to the key knowledge holders, but you also want to talk to people whose voices don't always get to be heard. And I would track this as I did my interviews. And the way that I determined influence is by your job. If you work in local government, you're obviously going to have some influence, but also by the amount of times your name came up in other interviews. Because if people kept on saying, oh, gee, you really got to talk to so-and-so, they're really at the center of this issue, they deal with it all the time, they have a lot to say, I would think, okay, so this person is really important. And then as my snowball grew and I was able to finally meet these people, when I heard what they had to say, I realized that a lot of the stories they were telling and the metaphors they were using, I'd already heard. Because they were key knowledge holders, people were listening to them and sharing their stories. So that's how I knew, okay, this person has a lot of influence. The way I analyzed these interviews got a little complicated. You can see by all of those various colors, I don't even know what those colors ascribe to at this point. But it would involve that I would transcribe every audio recording, and then I would re-listen to the audio recording, and I would highlight quotes. And as I highlighted quotes, I would develop a shorthand code. And anytime I came up with a new code, I would go back to the other interviews I'd already listened to see, oh, did I miss this? Was this actually in that past interview and I didn't realize it until I read this one and listened to this one? And so this process looked like listening to an interview, highlighting quotes, going back, making sure I didn't miss anything, listening to a new interview, highlighting quotes, going back, making sure I didn't miss anything, and repeating this until I felt like I had a good understanding of the most prominent themes that people were bringing up. So that's what this is kind of showing. It's showing the way that I kept track of how often certain things were coming up, because that's how I knew those are the important issues and themes that people brought up the most often. As I did this, my final step was to compare all these themes and codes with research memos and participant observation notes. Research memos were essentially after every interview, I would write down my personal experience of it. I'd write down my initial thoughts, how I felt the interview went. And this was really important because who I am, my worldview, my biases, that's going to affect the way I interpret what people tell me. It's also going to affect what they choose to tell me. And so by keeping track of these memos over time, I was able to see how my own biases and worldview was being changed by the people I spoke with. Okay, that's enough of me blabbing. Let's listen to what people had to say. So we're going to talk about different quotes and stories that came up the most often. I've organized the rest of this talk into different kind of mini chapters, all associated with that model that I presented earlier, but you'll see the way that interviewees really took it in their own direction every time. Let's start with risks and benefits. There were risks people saw accompanying wolves, and there were benefits. A lot of different ones, as you can see, and I'll read some quotes highlighting each of them. So let's start with benefits. Ecological. People saw an ecological benefit of having wolves here in the gorge. For example, this rancher said, "Our elk herd up here have that foot disease, and there's no big predators that will take care of that problem, which that's what nature intends, I think. So I think we need wolves to solve a lot of the problems of our weekend wildlife." Another benefit was something that had to do with a longing for the way things used to be. And this person said, "I think it's cool to have a large carnivore back on the landscape. Sometimes I get disenchanted with things that are so far removed from the way things probably used to be. There's actually a term for it called solastalgia. It's basically a longing or a reminiscence for the way things used to be, especially in the natural world." So those were some benefits. There were also some risks. The one that came up the most often, of course, was livestock loss. And this rancher had to say, "There's a day that I will literally probably have to change my livelihood because of these policies. I wish that the people that didn't have to deal with wolves, who just thought they were cute and cuddly, thought about things like, well, do you want the beef that you consume or the sheep or the pork to just have to live in and be fed their entire lives in tiny little feedlots because the predators are so crazy they can't possibly go out and eat green grass?" And then there was another risk, and I did not expect this one to come up, but it came up a lot. And what people were saying is, I'm afraid that wolves are going to incite community infighting, fracture neighborly relationships, and further polarize an already polarized place. Folks, and these were folks who both supported and resisted the idea of having wolves here, they would say, "Hey, I love living here. I love living in this rural place where I have to rely on others to make it out here. And I'm afraid that wolves are so controversial, they're going to take away the very thing I love most about living here, and that's my community. As an example, this person said, "To me, I see the risk of wolves being more of the breakdown of small local communities, where this is a great place to live because the same people that go to the Baptist church play basketball together and then go out in the woods and cut down firewood together. Wolf conflict can last generations or challenge the social fabric of a small community." So you may be reading that thinking, oh gee, I really like my community. This seems like a pretty bad sign. But I do think the fact that people cared so much about each other is actually a very good sign. And we'll continue to talk about that value of trust. Because I had these interview questions around risks versus benefits, something that's very quantifiable. It's a binary. But people began to center their conversations around this much more nuanced idea of belonging. More specifically, these conversations were about whether or not wolves belonged in the gorge. So you're all here to celebrate a sense of place, a dynamic, beautiful, and adventurous gorge that means a lot to you. So just take a moment to think. Do wolves fit into your sense of place? Do they belong here? Do they impact your ability to belong here? Would your opinion change if they did? Some people said no, wolves don't belong here. And their reasons included a belief that wolves were not historically here, or that they were here too long ago to matter anymore, since important cultural traditions had been formed over the generations since their absence. And changing these traditions to accommodate wolves, that didn't fit in with their sense of place. It didn't complement the way that they've been stewarding these beautiful landscapes their whole lives. But more importantly, wolves jeopardized their ability to belong. It wasn't uncommon for people to say something like, and I'll read a quote here, "The folks who are most amenable to the infiltration of predatory animals, that's those people from the outside." And they were afraid that those people would not respect their way of life and their values. At this point, they would usually turn to me, sitting across from them at the table, and say, "Now are you a country kid? Are you a city kid? What are you? Why are you asking me questions about wolves?" At which point, I was really glad that I was doing those research memos and doing that soul searching, because I could tell them honestly how I felt and how my opinions had been changing the more I talked to people. On the other hand, some people firmly believed that wolves belonged here. These people believed that wolves were historically here, and to them, allowing wolves to return after they had been killed off by humans, it felt like the right thing to do. There was a moral reason to it. And it also helped them feel like they belonged here. You'll remember that quote about solastalgia. Having wolves here meant a more complete gorge, and it meant that their sense of place was fulfilled as well. But overall, this sense of belonging, it came back to what I spoke about earlier, trust. For some people, whether or not wolves belonged in the gorge mattered less than whether or not they would be able to maintain their cherished relationships. And that was true regardless of how people felt about wolves. And even though there are differences, I think the fact that that came up so often is a sign that there is a desire to maintain this community. As an example of how people were thinking about relationships, I'll share a quote where this person said, "My cowboy said, I can't raise cattle to feed the wolves." And you can totally understand his point of view. "I love the fact that the wolves are coming here, but at the same time, I worry about my cowboy sticking with me to help with the maintenance. I just try to stay calm and not get too caught up in the fear." So we're going to transition to our next subject. We're going to talk about perceived control, the idea that people had some personal sense of control over their own situations. I would usually get at this by asking two questions. I would ask, do you have the ability to effectively protect yourself, your property, and the things you value as wolves return to the gorge? And do you feel like you have the ability to influence wildlife management outcomes? People had a lot to say about this. People were nervous about their ability to protect their property and themselves. And this was met by empathy with people who were excited about wolves. This quote right here was from someone who was very excited about wolves returning to the gorge, but they understood another perspective. They said, to have folks feel like they can't protect their own property, especially in rural counties, that is an affront to the notion of a very healthy idea of self-reliance and not expecting others to come to your aid, and in fact, physical impossibility of others coming to your aid. Like when you live and there's only 10 people per square mile, you are relying on yourself. And so it's a different culture born out of a different lived experience. And I think that gets missed in the debate a lot. So people had a lot to say about that. But I realized as I was having these conversations, they started to bring up something again and again that I should have been asking about in the first place. Fortunately, I didn't need to because they brought it up so often. And it was this idea, when you think about perceived control, your ability to handle a situation. Folks were saying, there are so many other underlying stressors. There are so many other things that make me concerned about continuing my way of life, that make me feel like I might not be able to continue my way of life. And if it wasn't for all those other things, maybe I could handle living with wolves. But wolves might be the one thing that pushed me over the edge if all these other issues are ignored. So I realized what I should have been asking is, do you have the ability to economically handle a changing rural landscape? But when you think about these other things, what were they? A lot of people had concerns about urbanism. Urbanism and development, it meant that there's less space. This also might mean inflation. It also might mean people moving to this place who have different values or different perspectives. A lot of people spoke about development as well. And this is something that was quite personal because, as I mentioned earlier, my farm hosts, they lost their land while I was working for them because they could no longer afford the cost of living. And multiple other interviewees, they brought this up too. They were talking about how increasing development may affect property costs, loss of hunting access, the splitting of parcels between private developers or among inheritors. And all this development, it made them think, who's going to share the land with the animals? Who's going to share the land with wolves? People also had a lot of concerns about a changing environment. Wildfire, decreasing elk and deer populations, extreme weather events, lack of controlled burns, lack of forestry management, which many people believed would result in wildlife being pushed into neighborhoods and places where people live, lots of concerns about water rights and water availability. And all of these concerns, they started to point to small family farms, because these farms are going to be hit the hardest by all these concerns, and they're the ones that have that much less ability to handle any other concerns, potentially by a predator like wolves. So it wasn't uncommon for people to say something like, I'm considered a small family farm, and every year there's so many that go out of business, and once they're gone, they're not going to come back, you know? So these metaphors that people kept on bringing up, a pressure cooker, a straw that broke the camel's back, wolves being that straw. People would say there's another endangered species, and that's the rancher. They would talk about a thin margin or being pushed over the edge. I would listen to this, and I would think, well, what are you gonna do? What's the solution? And yet again, wolves would bring us back to the value of trust and having a strong community. I remember I was interviewing a farmer while we sat on 2 hay bales, and her dogs were running around, and I was scratching her dog behind the ear. And I was listening to her talk about her concerns for the future, being able to afford farming, especially with increasingly stringent regulations she was talking about. And I said, well, what are you gonna do? And she said that she's gonna have to begin to rely increasingly on her community through bartering, because she said, and I'll quote her here, "Because I don't have any money, I farm on a shoestring. But I always have beef to barter, farm stuff, we build stuff all the time. So I'll just keep doing that." So far, everything we've talked about has led us back to trust. Conversations that were supposed to be about the perceived risk of wolves pointed us to the perceived risk of community infighting. Conversations that were supposed to be about whether or not wolves belonged in the gorge became conversations about whether or not people felt like they personally could or still do belong in gorge communities. Conversations that were supposed to be about your ability to control a situation ended up focusing on how people will have to rely on community support and bartering to be able to continue their way of life. So I'm going to take some time to discuss trust itself, because I asked every interviewee, do you feel heard or listened to by decision makers? And often people would answer that question, and then they would also talk about whether they felt heard or listened to by their community. So when I asked some folks, do you feel heard or listened to? Or if you chose to speak up, do you think people would listen to you? Some people said, yes, I do. And those folks often talked about how they had to go out of their way to be involved. So this hunter says, if I did not go out of my way to be involved, I don't think I would necessarily be heard, but I think the opportunity exists. Washington is somewhat unique in the way that we try to ensure that stakeholder voices are being heard, but nobody's necessarily going to come to you. You have to make sure you're loud when you need to be. Otherwise, people said they felt heard through their jobs, through any advocacy work they were a part of. A lot of people brought up education of younger generations, education of children. And then a lot of people said that they felt heard through their family and their community. And you might be thinking, I talk with my family every day. Does that really make that much of a difference? Can that actually change anything? Many people said it can. For example, this person, when I asked her, do you feel heard? She said, I believe so. Like I said, I speak with my family all the time, and I say, don't lose that teaching that Mom left for us. She may be gone, but her words and her heart and her teaching is with us forever, as long as we survive. And it's our job to just convey the word, the respect, the heart, the emotions for other beings and animals. We can't let that light dim. Otherwise, if it goes away, then we're a bunch of zombies. I found that to be inspiring. On the other hand, there were people who did not feel heard. And when people said, no, I don't feel listened to, this was often due to stereotypes. For example, this environmentalist said, not mine, as in their voice wouldn't be heard. There are too many stereotypes. People don't hear me anymore. I've been involved in so much stuff that there's absolutely no chance that anything I have to say as me is going to be heard unless I make a superhuman effort. People would also say that they had no opportunity to share their opinion, that no one has ever asked them. Maybe this interview was the first time someone ever had. Or they would say, I have tried to share my opinion, but I was told that my opinion wasn't true, and that was frustrating for me. They would also talk about performative efforts to listen, as in, yes, someone has asked me before, but I felt like after I shared what I had to say, they weren't listening to it meaningfully, and nothing ever happened. So this is what I was talking about earlier when I said I didn't want my research to be extractive. I didn't want to be the kind of person that listens and then never gives anything in return, because it can be really fatiguing for people. These same people, they were also saying that it was frustrating when people would make decisions on their behalf or claim to understand their point of view when those folks had never sat down with them in person or seen the places that they live and work firsthand. And then finally, people would say no, they don't feel heard out of a fear of retaliation. And this was true for people who supported wolves. This was true for people who resisted wolves. They were afraid that something bad would happen to them if they chose to speak up. And that fear was sometimes a fear of public censure, a fear of litigation, sometimes it was personal safety. As another example of someone who didn't feel heard, this hunter said, "I think they look at hunters like, oh, they're just rednecks. They don't know nothing. They're just out to kill everything. There's a lot of bad apples out there, don't get me wrong, but I'm teaching my boys to be respectful." So, I'm going to share some personal observations around trust. Because the best conversations always happen the moment I turned off my audio recorder. That's just the way things go. And I found as I did these interviews, people were really curious about the other side. They would say, those people that don't agree with me, do they actually say all those things that I hear they say? Whether it's from media or word of mouth, do they actually disagree with me as much as it seems? Or do we actually get along more than we think we do? You've spoken to people on all sides of this issue. What do they have to say? So people were curious. A lot of people asked for empathy. They said, look, I don't need people to agree with me, but I wish people could express some empathy for the hardships I'm enduring. Or they would say, I wish people would express some empathy for these wild animals that have lives. And so this emphasis across the board from all folks on curiosity and empathy, it leads me to the second thing I said that wolves taught me, the value of lived experience. People were saying that they wished the way that they see and acknowledge the world, they wanted that to be understood and incorporated into decisions and upheld as a valid way of understanding these landscapes. Not the only way, but a legitimized, valid, and valued way. So that gets us to the very last section of our talk tonight. Where do we go from here? What do folks want? What can we do? What's the solution? In every interview, I would ask people, what research do you want? What would serve you the best? What questions do you have that you want to see answered? And anytime someone answered that, I would try to paraphrase it into this shorthand way that I've presented it here. And you'll see on this research, the darker that segment is, the more people said they wanted research that had to do with that kind of question. You'll see that there are two segments that have the darkest color, because a lot of people wanted research that had to do with that. And that is research that involves learning from people with place-based knowledge, and research that involves building trust and cooperation at the local level. Let me explain what this means. People were saying, hey, I know things. I've lived here my whole life. I've worked on these landscapes my whole life, and I know a lot about the gorge. And it feels like a missed opportunity that the people who are researching this landscape and the animals within it, and the people that are making decisions about this landscape, are not incorporating all this knowledge I have into their understanding of this place. Especially if those people, I don't know, live in Seattle and are PhD students that don't live here. People were also saying that they wanted research that involved building trust and cooperation at the local level. They were saying, hey, there is fear of retaliation. There are a lot of people who don't feel heard, but I have a desire for that not to be the case. And just to kind of demonstrate how people were bringing up these research questions, I'm gonna read a few quotes. So this person said, research, talk about research. They will not take the time or the effort to be on the ground. They're either doing something else or they're in their office working on their paperwork to try to cover their butt. And they need to go out there and live on the ground like we do and see what's going on in the world. You know, that's the research that needs to be done. Then maybe they could answer some of these questions. Another person said, research about wolves or cougars? Well, I think research would be what you're doing already. You're talking to people that live in these areas, and that's boots on the ground research. You'll like the photo I chose of some muddy boots. I was really excited about that one. There's probably, I don't know, you could, for both sides of the story, reach out to the Cougar Foundation, wildlife biologists, get their take on it. So you kind of have a balance there. But as far as research, I think you're doing exactly what needs to be done, and that's interviewing individuals and their take on it. One last quote. This person says, "I would like to know if there is a way to dig really deep with ranchers and ask, what do you actually want? Or what would you actually need to feel comfortable living with wolves? I want to know why you feel that way, because sometimes we're going to be able to do something about it, and sometimes we're just not. There are things that I disagree with, but I also don't see if one side or the other just gets their entire way. That's also not really a sustainable path forward." So in science, we're so often taught to be objective. Science is a really powerful tool. I'm a scientist, and I believe in it. But science can only tell you what is, not what should be. Only the perspectives of people, their experiences, their emotions, their trials, their excitements, their solastalgia, that's what can tell you what should be. The interviewees that I spoke with, they brought up time and time again how much they cared about being able to trust and be trusted by their community. They also spoke about stereotypes, discredited reports, fear of retaliation, how all these things prevented them from being able to feel like there is trust within their community. But these quotes that I've just read, I think they demonstrate what a solution to these issues may be. And it involves incorporating new and different perspectives into your worldview and the way that you want decisions to be made. It means being curious. So when it comes to what's next, at least for me, the way that I'm gonna still try to find ways to incorporate others' perspectives and try to brainstorm some way to build cooperation around wolves and how we can all come to a consensus. One thing I'm gonna do is I'm gonna send out a survey that will continue to ask people to share their experiences so we can make sure that those are shared. So if you get a letter in your mailbox asking you about wolves, you'll know who sent it to you. And then something else is I will be doing a trail camera project to understand how wildlife and livestock are interacting throughout the gorge. And I want to conduct interviews alongside these trail cameras to see how people's perception of change, environmental change, and their perception of these landscapes, how that can be incorporated into research in tandem. So ultimately, if you came here tonight with one belief, I hope you're leaving with a perspective on another one. I was surprised again and again by the willingness of folks to not only speak with me, but to open their homes to me and to befriend me. And I was really surprised about their curiosity on the perspective of someone who may not necessarily agree with them. It meant a lot to people that I was willing to show up in person and that I was willing to listen. And through these conversations, the desire for trust and the desire to acknowledge each other's perspectives and lived experiences, that became more powerful than the conversations about wolves themselves. So being willing to listen and then doing good on a promise to share what you've heard, the parts you agree with and the parts you don't personally agree with, it may seem like a simple suggestion, but I think it can go a long way. Thank you very much for your time this evening, and more than anything, thank you to everyone who has shared all of their knowledge with me along the way. A lot of them, or some of them, are sitting in the audience, so you know who you are. It has meant so much to me, and I'm deeply grateful. Thank you.
Hi. I meant to tell you at the beginning that we always follow our talks, if you haven't been here before, with some Q&A time. So this is your chance. If you have a question, raise your hand. I'm going to hand you the mic because it really helps people at home be able to hear you if you use the mic.
Is there any plan to bring a mate to the Muddy Wolf?
There is no plan to do that. If a female wolf walks into the county and the gorge on her own, then there would be a mate, but no one is going to, there's going to be no human involvement for that.
Any other questions? Yeah.
So when you say there's one male wolf for the pack in the gorge, like what is that area you're considering to be the gorge? And kind of like how can you judge the impact of like what the wolves are on the community, like sending out a survey or whatever, when we're talking about like one wolf over that like area?
Definitely. It's a question I've thought a lot about. So I have focused my research on Klickitat County. So that's generally what I mean when I say the gorge. And so there's one male wolf in Klickitat County, in the western part of Klickitat County near Mount Adams. And when it comes to this idea of, okay, there's one wolf, what can this really tell us about the way that people relate to wolves? I think the fact that there is only one and people already had so much to say shows that there are inherited experiences or imagined futures that even if you don't have an experience with the wolf, you can look at other communities. You can look at Idaho, you can look at Montana, Eastern Washington, and already begin to form your opinions. And so I think a lot of people had that kind of perspective look. Some of the folks I spoke with, they have had experience in wolf areas, even if that wasn't in the gorge. So that's where their attitudes were coming from. A lot of people were saying, I've never had experience with wolves, but I have had experience with cougars. And they would base how they felt about wolves based on the experiences, positive or negative, they've had with cougars. But all to say, there is a lot of studies that show that people's attitudes towards large carnivores like wolves, they begin to form from the moment that animal is there on that landscape. So even if there's just one wolf, people are already starting to interact and think about it. But one thing that I do want to do with that survey is repeat it over time, because then we'll be able to see, as there are more wolves maybe in the county, we don't know, but if there are, then we can start to see how people's experiences and attitudes change over time as well. I hope that answers the question.
Thank you.
I'm wondering what what she said, organizations help like the wolves get a bigger population.
It's a great question. So in the gorge, wolves are managed by the Washington Department of Fish and Wildlife. So they will put on GPS collars, they'll track and see where wolves go. But when it comes to organizations that focus on the recovery of wolves, one that comes to mind is Wolf Haven International. They are a wolf center. They're in Tenino, Washington, so near Olympia. And if there are wolves or wolf dogs that have been in bad situations, they take them into their sanctuary and they take care of them and they live there forever. But they also have a breeding program for Mexican wolves and red wolves. You remember those wolves that I showed earlier that are smaller than gray wolves. And they breed pups there. And then the ones that are evaluated to be fit to be in the wild, they release those to the wild in New Mexico, Arizona, and South Carolina.
So my question was a little bit about what you just said about like what people are doing for like the red wolves. So is there like anything else that people are doing for the red wolves? Because that's a concern of mine, that we only have 19 left.
19 is so small. I can hardly, that is basically what, 3 packs maybe. I don't know as much about red wolves. I know that Wolf Haven, they have pups, they have red wolf pups that they're releasing back into the wild, but I don't know too much about other organizations that are working in South Carolina to bring them back, but you can definitely look them up online. I think recently they're having trouble with wolves crossing the roads. That's been a big issue. So if you think about ways to build wildlife corridors, bridges over roads or under roads so wildlife can move safely, that's going to be something that will help red wolves a lot.
Thanks for being here. My question is there similar research being done in the Wallowas in Northeast Washington that you can pull benefits from and help this community? Oh, that community figured out how to do it. How does that advise the locals to either not be more worried or be more worried, I guess?
Spoken like a good local public government official back here. Thank you for your service, recently retired. Thank you.
Would you like to be interviewed later?
Okay, sorry, I had to get that in there.
So as far as I know, there's been a good amount of ecological studies farther east in Washington. When it comes to studies that involve people's perspectives and their voices and how we can build trust, I don't know of any that have been conducted in those areas. I know that they have representatives on the Washington Wolf Advisory Group. So there are folks from those areas who will use that stakeholder group to advocate for their communities and for things that would help them feel more secure. But in terms of interview projects, I have not heard of any. But if someone has, please let me know.
This side of the room, I'm not impressed right now, guys. Okay, we got a couple here. Okay, I see you, and then we'll go to you, okay? Hang on to it.
I'm wondering if, in your research, if you studied the wolf that was called Romeo in Juneau, Alaska. And that wolf lived in the outskirts of Juneau for 6 or 7 years and interacted with dogs and people, and the community was very divided, whether you thought Romeo should be there or should not be there. Pretty fascinating story, and I just didn't know if you had researched that or studied it or knew much about that.
So the crazy thing is I've only heard about a different wolf named Romeo that was not in Alaska. It was about a wolf who I think was in the Slovenian Alps, and then he got an Italian girlfriend. So they called him Romeo because he's like, oh, he went to Italy and he had to go all the way there to find a mate. So that is the only Romeo I'm aware of, but I should look into Romeo #1/2.
It's a great book. You would enjoy it.
Thank you. That'd be awesome.
First of all, I just want to say how great your talk was. It was really, really interesting and well done. I appreciate that. And I'm kind of worried about our wolf here, and I'm wondering how long they live, so whatever his chances of actually ever finding a mate. That's all.
Yeah, I need to remember how old he is. I think he's pretty young. Wolves in captivity will live to 12 to 15 years, so like a dog. But in the wild, 8 years old is old for a wolf. And that's a lot of those studies are based off of Yellowstone. And Yellowstone's a totally different context because they have 100 wolves in that park. And the wolves, it's kind of like Game of Thrones. They have these warring clans and they do espionage. I swear they do espionage and they like fight for territories. So that a wolf will often die in battle, which sounds very Game of Thronesy. So that's why, like in Yellowstone, these wild wolves, they might live 5 years. That's different for this big muddy wolf. He doesn't have any competitors coming for his territory. So if he was to die, it would be maybe, going into a road, something else happening. I think he's pretty young, but I don't remember how old he is exactly.
Hi, thanks for the great talk. I'm wondering, I don't know if your research extended over this period or if you were just informally talking to people, but I'm curious what people thought about the death of the wolves across the spectrum. Were they relieved? Were they happy? Were they, you know, what's the range of reactions that you heard?
So my research mainly took place in the summer of 2023, and that was before the female went missing, and then before that other male wolf came into the county and was killed. So at that point of time, people believed we have a male and a female and we'll probably have pups in the spring. So I think people were approaching it from a much different perspective. I've continued to live and work in the Gorge since then, but I didn't conduct any formal interviews at that time. So I don't know what people would have to say.
Sorry, guys. Okay, let's do one more, and then I got a couple things to say, and then I think Laura can stay up a little bit past your bedtime and talk further, right?
Yes. Thank you for such a wonderful and thoughtful and insightful talk. Two really hard-hitting questions. One, how do wolf packs get their names? And two, less funny, how do they know anything about how the male wolf and the female wolf in Klickitat County, how they died or disappeared?
So wolf packs get their names. I'm not sure for all packs. I can tell you for the Big Muddy pack, they are named, I believe they were named by the Yakima Nation because a big proportion of the Big Muddy territory is on Yakima Nation land. And they first sighted the wolves around the Big Muddy River Creek, the Big Muddy Creek. So that's how they get their name. And I imagine that the other wolves, it often has to do with the geographic location. In terms of the other question for ideas about how the female may have disappeared, I've definitely heard a lot of different ideas, but in terms of the truth, we don't know because she was not GPS collared. The difference is this male wolf, the Big Muddy male, and the other male was GPS collared, so they were able to find the other male wolf when it died and see how it died. But for the female wolf, there's no evidence.
Okay, I'm going to ask you one question and think on it some while I do some wrap-up stuff. I'm going to change it a little bit from what we talked about. So one of the things when I was researching the human-wildlife interactions up at UW, the research that's going on, one of the things that I learned was that it's expected this is only going to continue to go up based on changes in our climate and environment, more people. And so I'm curious about sort of what new paradigms we might be seeing around human and wildlife interaction, but also what examples around the world might already exist for how this has been dealt with in a successful way. I don't know if successful is the right word, but you get what I'm at. Okay, all right. Alex, if you will help, God damn it, nice. Thank you. So real quick, I want to tell you guys what's coming up. January 15th, Post Canyon, More Than Skinnies and Single Track. You do not need to be a mountain biker to come to this. We need 3 people to talk about this, and I'm sure there's all you people out there who think we should have this person or that person or that. There's a reason I picked the 3 that I did. I hope you come listen to them. Doug Teeses, Hood River County Forester, Gary Pash, born and raised Gorge resident and mountain biker, and Arthur Babbitts, a little bit mountain biking, a little bit county commissioner. So we'll be hearing from them on January 15th. I also know we're going into the holidays, and I got you all a gift. That's not it, but I'll tell you about that first. Okay. This gift is coming in the spring, don't worry. Some of you may have joined us last week. Oregon Humanities came out and did one of their Consider This events here, and the thing they wanted to talk about was a project that Sense of Place is doing. This is to celebrate our 15th anniversary. In April, we are having an event called the Watershed Rock Opera. There's more if you want to learn about it on its website. if you were at Consider This or want to see us talking about it, I was joined by Abigail Elder, our Hood River County city manager, and also Leslie Tamora, a fourth-generation orchardist who lives here in the Gorge. And we talked about why the hell a bunch of musicians and city managers and tribal members and scientists are getting together to do a project like this. So that is coming in April. Stay tuned. I think it's going to be pretty popular. This is my gift. I'm going to miss you guys. I'm not going to see you until January 15th, and it's the holidays, and you're going to be with family, and maybe you're like, I need a break from everything, or I still need some stories. You may not know it, but we have a podcast called Here in the Gorge, and it's sort of audio narratives that you can take and listen to when you're folding your clothes or making dinner or going for a walk. And there's a handful of stories that span everything from Woody Guthrie to mountain search and rescue to some of the Japanese history we have here in the Gorge. So look that up, hereinthegorge.com. And that is the last piece. Then I wanted to thank all of you for joining us this year, 2024. A lot of what we talked about tonight and heard about is why I do this work. When I got asked to take over Sense of Place, it was honestly because I didn't have enough time with real people in my life. I spent too much time in front of a computer editing video and audio, and so it's so nice to have all these real people here in the room. I want to thank CCA, thank Alex up in the booth, thank our photographer. I don't know if I should go Big Bad Wolf or no, I did that for bugs. I know. Maybe I'm just like I feel like that. I looked like the one, right? Okay. Yeah, thank you. I want to thank the Gorge locals who are here who took the time to talk with Laura. Yeah. And now I want to give you a chance to tell us what you think.
Totally. So this question had two parts. One was paradigms we may need as humans and animals increasingly come into conflict. And the other part was success stories. So I think this question gets at a lot of what we just talked about, this idea that development and urbanism, it's going to squeeze people together. There was a quote up there that said, how are we going to share land with wild animals? And I think one paradigm that I at least believe in is the idea that people and nature are not separate. And we need to start considering ourselves as part of nature. And having this binary between wilderness, not wilderness, that doesn't exist. Even in the most urban, biggest cities there are wildlife that are interacting with people and learning how to navigate these entirely human-built landscapes. So I think the more we can do to start recognizing the fact that we are part of nature and that we affect it as much as it affects us, the more we'll continue to find ways to navigate this world that is going to increasingly bring us together. When it comes to examples of other places, there is this thing called bear smart communities. You may have heard of it. There's only a couple, mainly throughout North America. I think a lot of them are in Canada. And bear smart communities are similar to the Washington Wolf Advisory Group. It's a group of stakeholders, usually throughout just a city. So you'll have local government, you'll have enforcement officials, you'll have environmentalists, you'll have people who are concerned about bears, and they come together and they decide ways to live with bears. So maybe they'll create a program for locking up your trash at night or having someone that makes sure that your trash is locked up. And these communities are great examples of, maybe we can have wolf smart communities, which with ideas that can help people all across the spectrum live with wolves. So those are pretty cool. You can look them up online. I think your town can get Bear Smart certified. And then another thing I'll say is this idea of human-wildlife interactions. For the longest time, this field I work in was called human-wildlife conflict because people always focused on conflict, and it was always assumed that animals have a negative impact. But there's been a lot of push for people to say we can learn a lot from communities who have always lived with animals. And we can learn about the ways that they're able to do that. And I think there are communities that I've read about. I mentioned the Alps earlier. There's quite a few pastoral systems in the Alps that carnivores, they never left, and so they've still maintained this way of working alongside them. So those point to other examples of how we can try to navigate the system altogether.
Right. That is it, you guys. Thank you. Happy 2024 from Sense of Place, Season 15. Thanks, Alex.
Parts of it, but that's not something that Washington state government has done or will ever do. So that's, it's not really in the, from what I understand, it's not something that they're even thinking about.
And so if someone did do that, how would